Today you are going to hear the testimony of Karim al-Mansour. He was one of the most respected names in the Islamic world, a professor of theology at the University of Doha, a master in Quranic exegesis, a man who dedicated 2 decades to the pursuit of truth. But in a silent dawn, something shattered his world. A single click on YouTube changed everything. Before a video of Charlie Kirk, a debate about who Jesus really is, Karim began to feel that something inside him was collapsing. The man who challenged Christians began to be challenged by his own faith. What he saw, what he heard, and what happened next. No one was prepared for it. Today, you are going to discover what can happen when the search for truth collides with the very author of truth. And to begin, make sure you are already subscribed, like the video, and tell me where you are watching from, because this story is going to move you deeply.
I grew up surrounded by sacred verses. Since childhood, my life revolved around the rhythmic sound of Quranic recitations, the silent dawns when my father, a strict and deeply devout man, taught me to pronounce every word with perfection. There was something almost hypnotic about that ritual, the voices of the imams, the scent of burning incense in the mosques, the absolute reverence before a God I feared but never fully understood. I believed that knowing God meant deciphering texts, mastering languages, and winning debates. And that is what I did. I dedicated myself with almost military discipline. I studied classical Arabic, Islamic philosophy, comparative theology. By the age of 30, I was already a professor at the University of Doha and the author of several academic articles on tafsir, the deep interpretation of the Qur'an. My students saw me as an authority, and I believed myself to be a man enlightened by reason. But inside, something did not fit. Every time I read about Isa, the Jesus mentioned in the Qur'an, a restlessness would rise within me. The text said he was only a prophet, and yet it called him the Word of God, Kalimatullah. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was only a metaphor, a poetic form of expression. But then, why was that same word never used for any other prophet? That question grew inside me like a shadow. I pushed it away, diving deeper into books, doctrines, and ancient translations. Every verse I studied seemed to open another crack. My life was meticulously controlled. I woke before dawn, performed the obligatory prayers, taught my classes, reviewed manuscripts, attended international conferences. I was admired, respected, and feared by anyone who dared to question my interpretation. I used faith as a shield and knowledge as a sword. But inside me there was a desert, a dryness that words could not heal. I knew the texts, but I did not feel the God behind them. And that, though never admitted, tormented me. At night, I would sit alone in my office, the shelves filled with books up to the ceiling. Of the fan echoed with my doubts. Sometimes I would wonder, what if we are all trying to decipher a code that can only be understood by the heart, not the mind? And so I silenced it. Everything changed when I received an invitation to a theological debate in London, a major event broadcast live. The topic was provocative, the divine nature of Jesus. I was confident. I had debated Christians before and always won easily. I prepared for it like a warrior before battle. I reviewed every argument, every passage, every citation from the Qur'an and the Gospel. On the day of the debate, the auditorium was packed. The lights, the cameras, the attentive audience, all of it fed my ego. Across from me sat a Christian apologist, calm, serene, with a steady gaze but no arrogance. He spoke with conviction, not aggression. And at one point, in the middle of one of my sharpest arguments, he interrupted me with a simple question. If God is perfect, why could he not reveal himself perfectly? For a moment, time stopped. I was speechless. That sentence cut through my mind like a blade. God, reveal himself perfectly. I tried to answer, but the words escaped me. The audience noticed my silence, and I just masked it, continued the debate until the end. But something inside me had changed. Back at the hotel, I stared at the ceiling for hours, unable to sleep. That question haunted me. The next day, still shaken, I began to compare the sacred texts again. The Qur'an, the Injil, the Gospel, and even ancient manuscripts I had carefully preserved. I searched for contradictions, but the more I read, the more connections I found. It was as if an invisible thread linked the two scriptures. The same God I sought through rules seemed to be revealing himself through love. For weeks I lived in that conflict. On one side, the voice of reason and academic pride. On the other, something new, silent, but deeply real. I tried to suppress it, but I could not. Until fate struck me with brutal force. I received a phone call in the middle of the night. My younger brother had died in a car accident. The world collapsed. I, who had so often comforted others with religious words, could now find no meaning at all. No verse comforted me, no prayer calmed me. For the first time I felt completely empty, and paradoxically ready to cry out. That night, kneeling on the floor of my room, I wept. Not as a theologian, not as a Muslim, not as a professor. I wept as a broken man. And with a trembling voice I said something I had never dared to say. If you are the truth, show me who you are. It was the first time my prayer did not come from a formula, but from a torn heart. The days that followed were a blur. I walked like a ghost through the university halls. I fulfilled my duties, but inside I was distant. Until one ordinary night, while aimlessly browsing YouTube, a video appeared among the recommendations. The title read, "Charlie Kirk debates a Muslim scholar about Jesus." Normally, I would have ignored something like that, but there was something different about that thumbnail, a curiosity pulling me in. I clicked, and that seemingly small decision would change everything. In the first few minutes, I felt my usual instinct, to analyze, to refute, to criticize. But something in the way Charlie spoke disarmed me. He did not attack. He asked questions. He spoke of Jesus with a quiet yet firm conviction. And then he quoted a verse that froze my body. "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was God." I paused the video. I looked at the screen, confused. "Word," I murmured. "Kalimatullah." It was exactly the same term the Qur'an used for Isa. I stood up and began pacing around the room. How could this be? Why did both texts, so different, use the same expression to describe the same person? And why did that name, Isa, echo within me so powerfully? That night I closed my eyes, trying to silence the whirlwind of thoughts, and then something happened. Absolute silence filled the room. The air became dense, almost tangible. And suddenly I heard a voice, soft, clear, but unmistakable. It was not a physical sound. It was as if it spoke within me, cutting through every thought. "I am the Word, and I have always been with you." My whole body trembled. I opened my eyes, and for a brief moment, the room seemed wrapped in a soft, almost golden light. It was not blinding. It was alive. I saw no one, but I felt a presence so intense that I could barely breathe. I felt a peace I had never known before, and at the same time, a wave of emotion that made me weep like a child. I could not explain it. I just cried. I cried with relief, with fear, with repentance, with something that had no name. I, the scholar who had sought truth in books and theories, was finally finding it, not in written words, but in a living voice. There were no lightning bolts, no mystical sounds, only that sentence echoing inside me, repeating until silence covered me again. "I am the Word." I remained there, sitting on the floor, my face wet with tears, trying to understand what had just happened. Part of me wanted to deny it, to rationalize it, to say it was exhaustion, emotion, grief. But another part, the part I had never allowed to speak, knew it was real. At that moment, Something inside me broke, and at the same time something new was born. It was not the end of my search. It was the beginning of something I still did not understand. And although I did not know what would come next, I knew one thing. After that night, nothing would ever be the same. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. The room was still wrapped in shadow, and for a moment, I thought I had dreamed it all. That voice, that light, that presence, could they have been only the product of my exhaustion? But something was different. The air felt lighter, and there was an unusual serenity within me. I sat on the edge of the bed and realized that my body was free. No pain. For 10 years I had lived with a persistent pain in my back, a constant weight that made me rise carefully every morning. But that day, it was gone. I stood slowly, expecting the usual discomfort. Nothing. I bent forward, touched my feet, and still, nothing. No twinge, no limit. It was as if my body had been restored from the inside out. I stood there in silence, trying to understand. There was a new peace, almost tangible, filling the space around me. It was not just the absence of pain. It was as if something within me had been released from an invisible prison. I walked to the mirror, and when I saw my reflection, I felt a shock. My eyes, those same tired eyes marked by nights of study and doubt, looked different. There was a brightness, a clarity, as if they had been washed from the inside. I cannot explain it, but for a moment I felt that it was not me looking back. It was as if another life, a new life, had awakened within me. As I tried to understand what was happening, I heard the soft sound of the door opening. My mother entered. She was a woman of faith, but also of strictness, used to seeing me always immersed in books and rituals. When she looked at me, she stopped. She stood there in silence, her hand on her chest, watching me with a mix of surprise and emotion. "What happened to you, Kareem?" she asked. "You look like a different man." I smiled, not knowing what to say. How could I explain something I did not fully understand myself? I simply said, "Mother, I'm fine." She approached slowly, placed her hand on my face, and for the first time in many years, she embraced me without restraint. And in that embrace, I realized something within me had been restored, not just in my body, but in my soul. Later, when I returned to the university, everything seemed different. The same walls, the same corridors, but it was as if the world had changed color. The sounds, the faces, the very air. Everything seemed alive. I felt the desire to give thanks, not with formulas or repeated prayers, but with my heart. The God I had feared as a judge now revealed himself as a father who did not just observe from afar, but who had touched me, healed me, found me where I least expected. For days I lived as if I were floating, every simple detail, the song of birds, the warmth of the sun on my skin, even the sound of turning book pages, felt like a gift. But at the same time, a fire grew within me, the desire to understand more, to know the one who had set me free. I began to seek answers, to read texts I had once considered forbidden. I picked up a Bible for the first time, not as a critic, but as a learner. At first, I felt resistance. It was as if every word challenged me to unlearn what I knew. But the more I read, the more everything made sense. The passages that spoke of love, forgiveness, and grace had the same tone as the voice I had heard that night. It was as if the words leapt from the page and spoke directly to me. I was no longer studying about God. I was being found by Him, verse by verse. But every true transformation comes at a price, and mine began to be demanded when I decided to no longer hide what I was experiencing. I did not speak with arrogance. I did not challenge anyone. I simply shared discreetly with close colleagues what I had discovered, or rather whom I had found. At first, some listened with curiosity. They asked about the similarities between Isa and Jesus, about what I had truly felt. Others, however, began to avoid me. And then the rumor spread. First, in the university halls, then among the professors, and within a few days it was no longer rumor, it was accusation. They called me to a meeting with the academic council. I sat before men I had admired for years, conference colleagues, research partners, but now their gazes were cold. They spoke in a diplomatic tone, but the meaning was clear. I was crossing boundaries. One of them said with a restrained voice, "Karim, your role is to teach, not to question the foundations of the faith." At that moment, I realized I had crossed an invisible line, not of rebellion, but of freedom. Days later, I was officially dismissed from the university. The reasons were written in technical terms, but I knew the real cause. The looks on campus, once respectful, had grown heavy. Conversations stopped when I approached. The messages on my phone went from dozens a day to none. I, who had once been admired, was now avoided as if I carried a disease, and unfortunately it did not stop there. When I returned home, I found my mother crying. She had received calls, anonymous messages, people saying that I had betrayed the faith, that it would be better if I left the city. My own older brother called me a disgrace. The pain of family rejection was worse than any public criticism, but even so, something inside me kept me firm. It was as if the same voice that had called me that night was now saying, "Do not fear, I am with you." As the weeks passed, the situation grew worse. One day, when I returned from the street, I found my door scratched with offensive phrases, broken bottles at the entrance, trash thrown in the garden. The silence I once feared now became a refuge. I began to live almost in hiding, avoiding going out. The nights were long and fear tried to dominate me, but strangely, even in the midst of fear, I felt a new strength. I cried, yes, and sometimes asked God if I had gone mad, if all of this was real. But all it took was to close my eyes and remember the voice, the light, the love I felt, and my heart grew still. It was strange. On the outside, my life seemed to be falling apart, but inside, I had never been more whole. I remember one night in particular. The wind was blowing hard, and I sat alone, looking at the books scattered across the room. All those years of study, of pride, of certainty, now seemed small before the greatness of what I had experienced. I picked up the Qur'an, opened to a random passage, and my eyes fell once again on the name Isa. But this time, I did not read it as prophet. I read it as someone who finally understood what those words had been trying to say from the beginning. That truth is not an idea, it is a person. In the days that followed, I began to receive messages from former students, curious about what was happening. Some came in a tone of criticism, others seeking answers. I replied to all of them calmly, without attacking, without defending. I simply told them what I had lived. I said, "For years, I sought to know God with my mind, but He decided to reveal Himself to my heart. Even so, every word came at a cost. In a short time, I lost all invitations to international conferences. Theological journals cancelled publications with my name. And within months, the man who once traveled the world speaking about faith could now barely leave home without being followed. Even so, I did not feel anger. I felt compassion, because I had once been on the other side, the side of fear, of judgment, of the pride that keeps the soul from seeing. Sometimes, in the loneliest hours of the night, I would kneel on the cold floor and speak to God in the simplest way possible, without formulas, without recitations, just me and Him. And the more I did this, the more I felt that I was not alone. The losses were many, but the old emptiness, that was gone. I no longer lived to be admired. I lived to be guided, and although the consequences of my choice were only beginning, I knew there was no turning back. Something within me had been sealed forever, and even without understanding what was to come, I felt, with an unexplainable certainty, that all of it was part of something much greater. I had asked God to show me the truth, and He had answered, but I still had no idea how much that truth would cost me. nor how it would change the destiny of so many others who, like me, were searching for the true meaning of faith. The months that followed were a journey that not even the most disciplined man I once was could have foreseen. I had lost almost everything: position, security, name, respect, but gained something that no academic title could ever offer: the certainty of having found the truth. Even so, life was far from stable. I still carried within me a mixture of fear and hope, and it was in that fragile territory that God was preparing the next chapter of my story. I moved to a small European country. I wanted to start over, far from watchful eyes, far from threats, and the constant reminder of who I had been. I rented a small apartment on the outskirts of a cold, quiet city covered in fog. There, no one knew me. It was like disappearing from the world and starting from zero. I walked the streets with my hood up, an ordinary man among many. In my pocket, I carried only a small New Testament in Arabic, a gift from a missionary I had met during my travels. I read those pages every night, sometimes with tears, sometimes with anger, but always with hunger. Hunger to understand what God Himself wanted from me. It was during one of those silent days that I received an email. The sender said he was the organizer of a large international event on faith and science to be held in Brussels. "We are bringing together scholars and thinkers from different religious traditions to discuss the relationship between reason and transcendence," the message said. And at the end, one sentence made me freeze. Among the confirmed guests is the American speaker and debater Charlie Kirk. For a moment, I thought it was a joke. Charlie Kirk, the same man whose video had changed the course of my life, the same one who, without knowing it, had been the trigger for my transformation. I stared at the screen, feeling my heart race. The proposal was for me to participate in the panel as a representative of reformed Islamic thought. Though they still did not know about my conversion, I could simply refuse. It would be safer, more reasonable. But a voice inside me said the opposite. "Go back," it whispered. "Not to defend ideas this time, but to testify." I took a deep breath and accepted the invitation. The days leading up to the event were a mix of anxiety and prayer. I wondered if I was ready. After all, I was no longer the confident scholar I once was, armed with arguments and quotations. Now I was simply a transformed man, and in a way vulnerable. But at the same time, I knew I couldn't waste that opportunity. It was as if God was calling me once again to the center of the arena, not to fight, but to serve. When I arrived at the auditorium, the lights blinded me for an instant. The place was immense, modern, filled with journalists, cameras, and scholars from different religions. I recognized Charlie from afar, the same calm face, the same steady gestures. When our eyes met, I felt a wave of emotion. He had no idea who I was, nor that the man now walking toward him had once been one of his fiercest critics. The moderator introduced me as Dr. Karim Al-Mansour, researcher in comparative theology. The introduction sounded strange to my ears, like the echo of an old identity. I sat before the microphone and waited. The debate began with general themes: science, faith, morality, the meaning of life. I answered calmly, choosing my words carefully. I avoided controversy, but as the dialogue progressed, I felt the moment for which I had been brought there was approaching. Charlie spoke about the harmony between faith and reason, about how truth does not fear investigation. His words struck me in an almost prophetic way, and then, without planning to, I asked to speak. The auditorium fell silent. I took the microphone and felt my hands tremble slightly. For 20 years of my life, I studied the Qur'an seeking to understand the Creator, I said. But it was only when I stopped searching for answers and began seeking truth with my heart that I discovered who Isa truly is. A murmur swept through the audience. The cameras turned toward me. I continued. For years I taught that he was only a prophet, but the word of God confronted me, and I realized that reason itself led me to revelation. Because if God is perfect, how could his revelation be incomplete? Silence, absolute silence. It was as if the whole world had stopped for a few seconds. Charlie looked at me in astonishment, then with a faint smile of admiration. And at that moment, I realized there was no turning back. I was telling the world what I had once confessed only in prayer. After the event, reactions came like a storm. Some applauded, others attacked me furiously online. They called me a traitor, a heretic, a madman, but something surprising happened. In the hours that followed, I began to receive private messages, hundreds of them. They came from Muslims across many countries, men and women saying, "I also have doubts. I also wonder who Isa truly is. What did you feel? How can I learn more?" I spent nights responding, praying for them, quietly sharing what I had lived. Each new message was confirmation that my pain had not been in vain. If my story could reach even one sincere soul, every loss would have been worth it. But that public step brought new consequences. My social media accounts were hacked. I received direct threats. A friend advised me to move again, and I did. I went north, to a quiet place where I could continue my work without being recognized. With each change of address, I felt fear trying to creep in. I slept restlessly, imagining the sound of footsteps outside. Sometimes I woke in the middle of the night, wondering if I could really keep going. It was on one of those nights that I had one of the most intense moments of my journey. I sat at the table with my computer open, reading a message from a Syrian man who wrote, "I watched the debate. I was about to give up on life, but your words gave me hope. Now I want to know this Jesus you found." I cried. I cried in a way I hadn't in a long time. Because at that moment I understood every tear, every humiliation, every loss. It all had a purpose, and the fear that had followed me began to lose its power in the face of that certainty. Even so, it was not easy. Each day the battle continued. The fear of death was real. I knew I had put my life at risk, but the peace I felt was greater than the fear. And in the midst of solitude, I began to make a silent promise. If my story can save one soul, just one, then let my life be the price. Today, looking back, I realize that moment on stage was not just a public confession. It was the beginning of a new mission. From then on, I decided to live discreetly. I changed my name, my country, my appearance. I lived as an invisible man, but even hidden from the world, I knew I could not silence the truth that had transformed my life. That was when I began the project that now consumes my days and nights. I work in silence, translating the New Testament into Arabic, line by line, verse by verse, with notes showing the bridges between the biblical text and the Qur'an. I do this not to prove anything, but to allow others to see what I saw, to perceive the connections that a sincere heart cannot ignore. Many think I live in hiding out of fear, but the truth is, I live this way out of love. Love for souls still searching for answers. Love for those who, like me, grew up believing God was only justice and distance, never imagining that He is also grace and nearness. In the moments when longing and fear try to reach me, I turn on my phone's camera and record short messages, simple videos with a calm voice, my face mostly in shadow. I speak to whoever wants to listen, but especially to those who are afraid to ask. You are not betraying your faith by seeking the truth, I say. The true God never fears being known. Those videos spread more than I expected. People from many parts of the world began to write to me, using pseudonyms carefully, respectfully. Some said that for the first time they felt hope hearing someone speak about God without fear, without hatred. Others confessed they cried when they realized that perhaps the voice I heard that night might speak to them too. I do not seek fame. I do not seek applause. I seek faithfulness, because once you have heard the truth, pretending you haven't is impossible. When I speak about Jesus, I feel something hard to describe. The words flow on their own, and tears fill my eyes before I even notice. I always repeat the same sentence as a reminder to myself and to those who listen. I did not find him in a debate. He found me in my search. And that is exactly it. I sought him with my mind, and he came to my heart. I looked for him in the texts, and he revealed himself in the silence. My faith was not born out of rebellion, but out of revelation. It did not come from hatred, but from love. And that difference changes everything. Today, when I walk through the anonymous streets of the city that took me in, no one imagines the story I carry. An ordinary man, dressed simply, with a folder of books in his hands and a heart full of peace. The same peace I never knew while trying to understand God through logic. Now I know him through grace. And that grace, silent and powerful, is the strongest testimony there is.
And if you've made it this far, you've probably felt the weight and beauty of the story as deeply as I have. Kareem's testimony is not just about a man who changed his religion. It's about a heart that was reached when all human answers had already failed. It's about someone who knew the texts but didn't know the author. A man who spent 20 years searching for the distant God of fear and found the near God of love. And maybe, as you listen to this story, something inside you began to beat differently. Maybe it's the same voice that called Kareem that night, the same voice that still calls today, every person who is still searching for the truth. So if your heart felt that touch, repeat with me, wherever you are, with sincerity. I accept Jesus as my Lord and Savior. This is the most important decision of your life, because this is where the search ends, and true life begins. Write in the comments now, I accept Jesus, so that the world knows you too have been reached by this grace. And if this story touched you, leave your like and subscribe to the channel. Because with every video, new lives are being transformed, and yours could be next. And for you who stayed until the end, I want to leave a challenge of faith. Comment, I love Jesus below and see how many people are declaring that same love. And get ready, because the next video now appearing on your screen will deeply impact you. Former Muslim judge who persecuted Christians and signed death sentences until God humbled him. What God did with Kareem was extraordinary, but what he is about to do next will leave you speechless.